Excuse me, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you. Could I have whatever you're leaving behind? The bread, maybe? I haven't eaten in 3 days. I beg your pardon. I'm sorry. Forget I said anything. Have a good evening.
Wait.
I have told you before, you cannot come in here. Let's go, now, before I call security. Mrs. Holstead, I sincerely apologize for this.
Don't touch her, Calvin.
But ma'am, this girl is a vagrant.
This young lady is my guest. Bring her a chair and a clean place setting.
Ma'am, please, you really don't have to do this. People are staring. I don't want to cause a scene. I'm nobody. I don't matter.
Don't say that.
Calvin Ross had removed people from that dining room 100 times. He never once questioned who might be watching when he did it. Lenora Holstead had not moved since the girl appeared in the doorway. She was one of the most powerful women in the city, a woman who had spent 22 years carrying a grief no amount of money had ever touched. Something about this girl, thin and quiet and careful not to take up space, made Lenora go completely still. And in a woman like Lenora Holstead, stillness was never an accident. If stories like this stay with you, stories about dignity, about truth, finding its way back to the surface, subscribe to this channel. You won't want to miss where this one goes. The dining room of Archers had never been this quiet. Every table had gone still, silverware left untouched, glasses mid-lift, while Calvin Ross stood at the edge of the room, red-faced and waiting for Lenora Holstead to take it back. She didn't. She pulled out the empty chair beside her and looked at it, and that was the whole of her instruction. A busboy scrambled to set a second place. A server disappeared toward the kitchen. Calvin turned and walked the long way around to his podium, and the silence cracked open again into the low murmur of a room that had witnessed something it couldn't quite explain. Tessa sat down the way people sit when they're afraid the chair will be pulled out from under them, perched at the edge, spine straight, hands folded tight in her lap. The jacket she wore had a split seam at the left shoulder she'd been holding, closed with her thumb all evening. She let go of it now, just barely, and tried to breathe like someone who belonged there. Lenora Holstead had sat across from presidents, investors, and board members who thought that silence was a negotiating tool. She could read a room the way other people read a page. But as she watched this girl try to make herself small in a chair that was already hers, something moved through Lenora that had nothing to do with strategy. It was older than that. Quieter. "They'll bring you the salmon," Lenora said. "And soup first, if that's all right." Tessa looked up. "I don't need all of that. Really. The bread would have been enough." "It wouldn't have been," Lenora said simply. "But we don't have to argue about it." She said it without pity, which was the only way Tessa could have accepted it. There is a particular cruelty in being helped by someone who can't hide that they feel sorry for you. Lenora didn't feel sorry. She felt something else that she wasn't ready to name yet, so she refilled her water glass and said nothing more, while the kitchen sent out a bowl of white bean soup, warm rolls, a piece of seared salmon with lemon and capers, a glass of orange juice, and a small chocolate tart on a plate dusted with powdered sugar. Tessa ate slowly. Not because she wasn't hungry, she was hungry in a way that had long since passed the feeling of hunger and become simply the baseline of her body, but because she wanted to remember it. She thought she might want to remember this for a long time. 3 tables away, a woman in a cream-colored blazer set her own fork down with more force than necessary. Her name was Patricia Vance, and she made a comment loudly enough to be heard about the sort of establishment that had apparently abandoned its standards. She said she hadn't paid what she paid to dine next to someone who smelled like a parking garage. Her husband looked at the tablecloth. The couple to her left pretended they hadn't heard. Lenora heard. She turned her head toward Patricia's table with the calm of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. She mentioned in a conversational tone that she owned the building they were sitting in. She mentioned the block it stood on and the hotel chain on the avenue 2 streets west. She said that in her experience, the worst kind of poverty had nothing to do with what a person kept in their wallet. Patricia Vance picked her fork back up and didn't say anything else for the remainder of the meal. Tessa had watched all of it, the turn of Lenora's head, the level voice, the way the whole table across the room seemed to shrink 2 inches. And then she did something she hadn't done in months. She laughed. just barely, almost silent, but real. A laugh she immediately tried to suppress, because she didn't know yet if that was allowed here. "Thank you," she said. "I know that wasn't nothing. Thank you." Lenora looked at her. "Who told you that you didn't matter?" Tessa didn't answer right away. She pulled a small piece of bread apart and thought about it honestly. "Nobody had to," she said finally. "You figure it out on your own after a while." She told Lenora a version of her life in the way someone tells a story. They've learned to abbreviate the children's home on Belford Street called St. Agnes, the scholarship she had earned on her own, with no one in the stands. When she accepted it, the boy at university named Nolan, who had shown her what it felt like to be chosen. She didn't use the word love. She said he had been convincing, and that she had been willing to believe him, and that by the time she understood what he'd actually done, her name was on 7 loan agreements she had never read carefully enough. He was gone before the first payment came due. She had been on the street for 8 months. She said all of this without asking for anything. That was the part that stayed with Lenora. "St. Agnes," Lenora said. Her voice had changed by a fraction, not enough for Tessa to notice, but enough that Lenora felt it herself. "On Belford?" "Yes, ma'am. I was there from infancy. No one ever came for me. They told me my birth mother left me because she didn't want me, and after a while I stopped trying to think of a reason why that might not be true." She said it the way you say something you've made peace with, or have tried to. It was the most painful sentence Lenora had heard in 22 years, and she didn't know yet why it felt so specifically like her own. She looked at the girl across the table. She looked carefully the way she hadn't allowed herself to look before when looking felt like something she shouldn't need to do. The shape of the eyes, the particular curve of the mouth at rest. There was a faint dimple on the right side, just one visible only when Tessa's expression shifted. There was something at the edge of her jaw below her left ear, a small dark mark barely larger than a pencil point. Lenora picked up her water glass. She took a sip. She set it back down. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" she asked. Tessa glanced toward the window. "There's a covered walkway behind the library on 9th. It's dry mostly." Lenora looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "Come home with me." Tessa stared at her. "I have a large house and too many empty rooms," Lenora said. "You can sleep in a real bed tonight. In the morning, if you want to go, you go. I won't stop you." "You shouldn't trust me," Tessa said. The warning was immediate and genuine. "You don't know me. I could be anyone." "That's true," Lenora said. "I could be dangerous." "You could be," Lenora agreed. "Are you?" Tessa looked down at the remains of the chocolate tart on her plate. "No," she said quietly. "But you still shouldn't trust me. I'm a stranger." Lenora didn't argue the point. She said only that some meetings felt like coincidence and some didn't, and that in 63 years of life she had learned to tell the difference. She believed this one was the second kind. She didn't say why. She wasn't sure yet that she could. The Holstead estate sat behind an iron gate on the north side of the city, a property that appeared in architecture magazines and had been photographed enough times that the facade was recognizable to anyone who followed local history. From the outside, it was impressive. From the inside, in the dark, with most of the lights left off, it was something else, a house that was very large and had not been full in a very long time. The rooms on the ground floor held furniture that was polished weekly and sat entirely still. Flowers were replaced every 3 days. Artwork hung on walls that no one stood in front of. Tessa stood in the entryway and didn't move. Marlene Brooks came down the front staircase, the housekeeper, 61 years old, 22 of those years, in service to the Holstead estate. She was a measured woman who expressed herself primarily through the degree of precision in her movements, and the look she gave Lenora when she saw Tessa was not unkind, but was certainly full of questions. "Marlene," Lenora said, "please prepare the blue room." Marlene's hands stilled on the banister. She looked at Lenora the way you look at someone when you want to confirm you heard them correctly, without actually asking. The blue room at the end of the second-floor hallway had been closed since Lenora's daughter died. Not repurposed, not repainted. Closed. For 22 years, no one had been asked to open it. "Of course," Marlene said, and went back upstairs. Tessa was given a towel and a change of clothes, a soft gray pullover, and a pair of dark trousers that Marlene had folded with the precision of someone handling things that needed to be handled correctly. She stood in the bathroom of the blue room for a long time under the hot water, and when she finally turned it off, she stood in the steam and tried to understand what was happening to her. Nothing in 8 months of sleeping on concrete had prepared her for the specific disorientation of being safe. She came downstairs, still damp at the ends of her hair, and found Lenora in the dining room with 2 cups of tea she hadn't touched. The light in that room was different from the restaurant. Clearer. More still. And in that light, Lenora looked at Tessa's face again, not quickly this time, not at a careful distance, and she saw the mark below the left ear as plainly as she had ever seen anything. She saw the dimple on the right side appear when Tessa glanced toward the window and almost smiled at something she didn't explain. She saw the exact architecture of the mouth, the particular way the eyes were set. Julian Holstead had died 11 years ago. But Lenora had photographs. She had kept photographs the way people keep the things they cannot let go of, because letting go and moving forward are not the same thing, and everyone eventually has to choose which one they mean. Audrey Rose Holstead had been 6 months old when she was taken to Westbrook Medical Center with a high fever. Lenora and Julian had been told their daughter didn't survive the night. There had been a small service. There had been a grave with a white stone marker in the garden of a chapel on the east side of the city. Lenora had believed this for 22 years. She sat across from Tessa Navaro in the dining room of the estate and held her tea and said nothing. Because the thought forming in the back of her mind was one that she had not earned yet, not without proof, not without being certain, and she understood precisely what it would cost her if she let herself believe it and was wrong. She had already buried that child once. She did not think she could do it a second time, but she also understood sitting there in the quiet house with this young woman who had been left at St. Agnes Children's Home with no name and no record, and no one that she was not going to be able to let this go without knowing. She was not built for that. She never had been. "Get some sleep," Lenora said at last. Her voice was steady. She had spent decades learning to keep her voice steady. "We'll talk more in the morning." Tessa nodded and pushed back from the table. She thanked Lenora again, at the foot of the stairs, simply without extravagance, the way a person thanks someone when the only currency they have is sincerity. Then she went up to the blue room and closed the door. Lenora sat alone at the dining room table for a long time after that. She thought about Julian. She thought about a 6-month-old girl with a fever and a night that had rearranged every year that followed it. She thought about a caregiver named Teresa Mendes, who had disappeared from the city not long after the hospital called, and about the hospital records she had never gone back and questioned, because you do not tend to question a grief you are still trying to survive. She was questioning it now. By morning, she had already decided to make a call to Graham Mercer, the investigator she had trusted with sensitive matters twice before, a methodical man who was good at finding things that had been made not to be found. She would not tell Tessa. Not yet. Not until she knew. But she was going to find out what had actually happened in that hospital 22 years ago, and she was going to find out what had become of Teresa Mendes, and she was going to follow every thread of it to wherever it ended. She had spent 22 years believing she had lost her daughter. She was not going to spend one more day believing something that might not be true. Graham Mercer was not a man who called with updates unless the update was worth making. He had worked quietly for Lenora on 2 previous occasions, a matter involving a forged deed on a commercial property, and once to locate a former employee who had taken more than his severance. Both times he had delivered what he found without editorializing. So when his number appeared on Lenora's phone 4 days after she had hired him, she knew, before she answered, that he had found something. He had found Teresa Mendes in a town called Harlow, 214 miles from the city. She was living in a ground-floor apartment near a medical facility and had been receiving treatment for late-stage lung cancer for the past 7 months. Graham said she was coherent, that she had asked him twice who had sent him, and that when he said the name Lenora Holstead, she had not looked surprised. She had looked, he said, like someone who had been waiting. Lenora did not tell Tessa where she was going. She said only that she had an appointment out of town, and that Marlene would be there if she needed anything. Tessa was seated at the kitchen table with a library book she had borrowed from the shelf in the second-floor hallway. She asked, before taking anything, always as though she expected permission to be revoked, and she nodded without looking up in the way of someone trying very hard not to make too much of things. Lenora drove the 214 miles herself. Teresa Mendes was 67 years old, thin, in the particular way of someone whose body was spending all its reserves on something other than maintaining itself. She sat in an armchair by the window of her apartment, with a blanket across her knees. The apartment was clean and very spare. There was a wooden cross above the door and a photograph on the windowsill of a woman who might have been her mother. Teresa looked at Lenora for a long time before she said anything, and when she finally spoke, she said she had practiced this conversation in her head so many times that she wasn't sure the real version would feel like anything at all. It felt like everything. Teresa had worked as a private caregiver for the Holstead family and held a supplementary position at Westbrook Medical Center in the fall of the year Audrey was brought in, with a fever, an arrangement that Julian's brother Conrad had helped organize. She said she had liked the baby. She said Audrey had been an easy child, that she smiled more than most infants, that she had a small dark birthmark below her left ear that the pediatrician had noted was entirely benign. Teresa said she could still see it when she closed her eyes. Conrad Holstead had come to her 3 weeks before the night of Audrey's fever. He had laid out the situation with the clarity of a man who had thought it through carefully. If Audrey lived, she would be the primary heir to Julian's estate. If Audrey did not exist, that inheritance would pass differently. He did not use the word kill. He was careful about the words he chose. He said he needed the problem to resolve itself, and he named a figure, and he told Teresa he expected her to be practical about it. Teresa said she had taken the money. She said that part without flinching because she had already confessed it more times than Lenora would ever know, to priests and to God, and to the ceiling of every room she'd tried to sleep in for 22 years. She had taken the money, and she had used her position at Westbrook to manipulate the records, and she had told Julian and Lenora that their daughter had not survived the night. The fever had been real. The death had not, because when the moment came she could not do it. She had stood in that hospital room with a 6-month-old child who was already recovering the fever, breaking the color coming back, and she had understood that she was not in the end the kind of person Conrad believed her to be. So she had wrapped Audrey in a blanket, driven 40 minutes in the dark, and left her at the intake entrance of St. Agnes Children's Home on Belford Street, with no name and no documentation. The child had been logged as a foundling. She had been given the name Tessa Navaro by the intake coordinator, a name that meant nothing and came from nowhere because there was nothing to trace her back to. Teresa had left the city the following week. She had never returned. She had a document notarized 3 months earlier, when her diagnosis became terminal, a full written account of everything. She also had a recording. She had made it years ago during a period when she had been afraid Conrad might try to tie up loose ends, and she had kept it filed with a private attorney with instructions to release it on her death if nothing had been done. In the recording, Conrad's voice was clear and specific and unambiguous. She gave both to Lenora without conditions. She said the only thing she asked was that the child she still called her the child was all right. Lenora sat with that for a moment. Then she said yes. She said the child was all right. She said the child had a one-sided dimple and had been reading her way through the second-floor bookshelves and was planning to go back to university to become a teacher. Teresa covered her eyes with one hand and didn't say anything. Lenora didn't fill the silence. Some silences are not empty. She drove back to the city that same night and called Graham from the car. She gave him one instruction. She needed a DNA comparison, processed through a private laboratory, highest priority, no leaks. She told him how to obtain Tessa's sample without Tessa knowing. She was not proud of the deception, but she was not going to tell a young woman who had already lost everything that she might be her daughter and then be wrong. 48 hours later, Graham came to the estate. The result was 99.9%. Not a suggestion, not a likelihood. A confirmation. Tessa Navaro was Audrey Rose Holstead. Lenora read the report 3 times at the kitchen table before she went to find Tessa in the library. Tessa was cross-legged in the window seat with the same book she'd started 2 days ago, and she looked up when Lenora came in with the particular alertness of someone who had learned that unexpected visits usually meant something was wrong. Lenora sat down in the chair across from her and told her everything. She started with Westbrook Medical Center and the night of the fever. She told her about the grave with the white stone marker that she had visited every year on the same date in April. She told her about Teresa, about Conrad, about the recording. She told her about Belford Street and the intake log and a name that had been given by a stranger in the middle of the night. Then she placed the DNA report on the cushion between them. Tessa didn't pick it up right away. She looked at it the way you look at a door you're not sure you want to open. Then she picked it up and read it, and her hands were steady, and her face was steady, and Lenora could see the exact moment it landed. A stillness that was not calm, but the opposite of calm. The kind that happens when something too large moves through a person too quickly for the body to process. Tessa set the paper down and looked at the window for a long time. "You never left me," she finally said. It was not a question. It came out like something she was testing the weight of a sentence she'd needed to say out loud to find out if it would hold. "I never knew you were there to leave," Lenora said. "I thought you were gone." Tessa looked at her, and then she said something she had never said to anyone in 22 years of living, not because she was dramatic about it, but because she had simply never had the occasion to mean it. She said, "Mom." They held each other in the window seat of the library for a long time, and neither of them said anything else that needed to be said, because the thing that needed to happen had happened, and words at that point would have only been smaller than the moment. In the days that followed, Tessa told Lenora about Nolan Reyes in more detail than she had in the restaurant, the exact shape of the deception, the loan agreements, the amount, the way he had vanished, before she could understand what she'd signed. Lenora listened without interrupting. Then she called her legal team and told them to begin building a fraud case. She said it with the same tone she used to close a real estate deal, not heated, not personal, simply a matter of something that needed to be done correctly. Tessa said she didn't want the money back. She said what she wanted was to go back to school. Lenora looked at her daughter. She was already thinking of her that way. Had been thinking of her that way since the library, possibly since the restaurant, and felt something shift in her chest that she recognized as pride. Not the reflexive kind, not the kind that comes from watching someone accomplish something expected of them. The kind that comes from watching a person who had every reason to become smaller, instead remain entirely themselves. It was Conrad who disrupted what might have been in another version of events, a quiet and private reclamation. Word that Audrey Holstead was alive reached him through channels Lenora had not anticipated. By the time her lawyers had begun the fraud case against Nolan, Conrad understood that the inheritance question had reopened. He understood what it meant. 22 years of careful maneuvering. The money he had absorbed, the positions he had taken within the Holstead estate's subsidiary holdings, all of it rested on the assumption that Audrey was dead. A living Audrey was not simply an inconvenience. She was the end of everything he had built. Nolan Reyes. When Conrad found him, was living in a furnished apartment in a suburb on the west side of the city, surviving on the money he had taken from Tessa. Nolan was at his core a practical person. When Conrad explained what he knew about Tessa's new circumstances, Nolan did not react with guilt or surprise. He reacted by asking what was in it for him. They agreed quickly, the way two people agree when they want the same thing for different reasons. Conrad needed Lenora to reject Tessa. Nolan needed to disappear from Lenora's legal crosshairs. The solution they arrived at required neither violence nor risk, only the right story told to the right person at the right moment. What they built over the following week was a lie designed to fit exactly the shape of Lenora's oldest fear. They produced photographs, digitally altered, but carefully, that showed Tessa and Nolan together at locations near Archer's restaurant in the weeks before the night she had walked through its doors. They found a man named Derek, a former associate of Nolan's, and paid him to sign a statement claiming Tessa had told him months earlier that she knew who her birth mother was and intended to use that knowledge. They wrote letters in Tessa's name printed on paper, sourced to match what St. Agnes had used in its correspondence decades ago. The forgeries were not perfect, but they didn't need to be perfect. They only needed to arrive at the right moment when Lenora was still new to hoping, and therefore most vulnerable to the possibility that hope had made her careless. The package reached Lenora through Conrad, directly delivered with the performed reluctance of a man who claimed he hated being the one to bring it. He sat across from her in the drawing room and said he wanted her to be right about the girl he truly did, but that as someone who cared about her, he couldn't stay silent when he had seen this. Lenora took the folder. She read the statement. She looked at the photographs. She did not say anything in front of Conrad. She waited until he left, and then she sat with it for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, she had not resolved it, and the unresolved thing was sitting between her and Tessa at dinner like a third person at the table. Tessa noticed. She was perceptive in the way of people who have spent years reading rooms for signs of danger, and the change in Lenora's manner was not subtle enough to miss. She asked carefully if something was wrong. Lenora said no. It was the first time she had lied to her daughter since finding her, and she felt it go down badly. The question she could not stop asking herself was the one Conrad had constructed, the evidence specifically to provoke what if the girl had known, what if the approach at the restaurant had not been accidental. Lenora had been moved by Tessa's hunger, by her dignity, by everything she had said and not said. But Conrad's file was asking her whether any of it had been real, and the specific cruelty of the question was that the DNA result couldn't answer it. The DNA confirmed who Tessa was. It said nothing about what she'd intended. 3 days later, Lenora sat down across from Tessa and asked her directly whether she had known who Lenora was before that night. She asked whether she and Nolan had still been in contact. She asked whether the encounter at Archer's had been arranged. Tessa went very still. It was not the stillness of someone caught. It was the stillness of someone absorbing a specific kind of pain. She looked at Lenora for a long moment, and then said quietly that she wasn't surprised by the question. She said she knew she had no history, no references, nothing to offer as proof of who she was beyond what Lenora had already seen. She said she understood why doubt felt safer than trust. She said all of this without her voice breaking, and then she pushed back from the table and went upstairs. 20 minutes later, she came back down with her bag, the same worn canvas bag she had arrived with, now containing the few items Marlene had quietly replaced for her. She said she wasn't angry. She said she wanted Lenora to know that. She said the thing she had wanted from all of this was never the estate or the name or the inheritance. She said the thing she had wanted, the only thing she had needed, was one person who would decide to believe her. She said if Lenora couldn't do that, then she would rather go back to 9th Street than stay in a house where she was a suspect. Lenora stood up. She crossed the room. She put her hand on the door before Tessa could open it, and she kept it there, and she said one word, "Stay." Tessa looked at her. "I'm not going to lose you twice," Lenora said. "I'm not going to let that happen." She told Tessa about the folder, about Conrad, about the photographs and the statement. She said she had looked at them too long and thought about them too hard, and that if she were honest, the thing that had finally settled it for her was simple. A person running a con does not walk away from $100 million inheritance to protect their dignity. Only someone who actually had dignity did that. She said she should have known sooner. She said she was sorry. Tessa set her bag down. They stood in the hallway of the estate, the two of them, and Lenora said they were going to find out who had put that folder together and why. She said they were going to do it together. Tessa nodded once, and that was the agreement, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Graham Mercer needed 48 hours. Lenora gave him that, and he used all of them. He started with the photographs, which was the right place to start, because photographs are specific. They contain light sources, shadow angles, and metadata that a skilled forger can manipulate, but rarely eliminates entirely. The images Conrad had delivered showed Tessa and Nolan together near Archer's restaurant in the weeks before the night she had walked through its doors. They looked convincing at a glance. Under analysis from a digital forensics consultant in the city's financial district, they looked like exactly what they were. Two separate images composited onto a shared background, the light falling from inconsistent directions, the resolution along Tessa's figure slightly too smooth to be a natural photograph. The consultant put it in writing. Graham had it notarized before the second day was out. The man named Derek, the one who had signed a statement claiming Tessa had told him months earlier about her birth mother, was easier. Graham found him through Nolan's financial records, which the legal team had already subpoenaed as part of the fraud case. Derek had received a wire transfer of $8,000 11 days before the statement was dated. When Graham presented him with this information in a coffee shop on the east side of the city, Derek sat with it for about 4 minutes before he said that he wanted to know what kind of deal might be on the table. Graham said that wasn't his department, but that cooperating tended to go better than not cooperating. Derek agreed to sign a corrected statement. He also agreed to appear in person if it came to that. By the time Graham returned to the estate with his findings, Lenora already had Teresa's notarized account and the recording locked in the document safe in her study. Now she had both. The forgeries tied Conrad and Nolan together in the present. The recording tied Conrad to the original crime, and Derek's recanted statement removed the only human witness they had manufactured. Lenora sat at her desk for a while after Graham left and looked at the collection of documents in front of her. Then she picked up her phone and called Conrad. She kept her voice exactly level. She told Conrad that she had looked carefully at the materials he'd brought her and that she had made a decision. She said she had been foolish to let sentiment override judgment. She said she was removing Tessa from the estate and intended to begin the process of reverting the inheritance filing. She said she would appreciate it if he could come by the house to discuss the family's next steps, and that she thought Nolan should be there as well, since it seemed the two of them had a better understanding of the situation than she had initially realized. Conrad agreed immediately. He was at the estate by 2 o'clock the following afternoon, and he brought Nolan with him. Tessa was not visible when they arrived. She was upstairs, and the house was quiet, and Conrad walked into the drawing room with the easy confidence of a man who believed the hard part was behind him. Nolan followed him, and looking slightly less comfortable, he was better at running than at standing still, and something about the stillness of the estate seemed to bother him. Lenora was already seated when they came in with 2 chairs arranged across from her, and she gestured to them with the same calm she had used at Archer's to gesture to a busboy for a second-place setting. Conrad began by expressing what he called relief. He said he knew it wasn't easy to accept, but that Lenora had clearly made the right call and that the family would be better served by moving forward than by allowing an outsider to disrupt what had taken decades to build. Nolan said nothing. He was watching the room. Lenora let Conrad finish. Then she reached forward and pressed a button on the small device sitting on the table beside her, and the room filled with a voice that Conrad had not heard played back in 22 years. It was his own. The recording was not perfect in quality. It had been made covertly on equipment available in an earlier decade, but the words were clear enough. The instructions were clear enough. The specific phrase he had used, that he needed the problem to resolve itself, came through the speaker with the weight of something that had been waiting patiently for a very long time to be heard by the right people in the right room. Conrad's face went through several things in rapid succession. He started to stand. He started to speak. He stopped both. Nolan had already pushed back in his chair and was looking at the door. The door was not the option either of them thought it was. Tessa came down the stairs. She walked into the drawing room and stood at the edge of it and looked at the 2 men who between them had taken her name, her education, her safety, and 22 years of a life she should have had. She did not look like someone who had been sleeping in a covered walkway behind a library 8 weeks ago. She looked like someone who had always known exactly who she was, and had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Graham stepped in from the hallway where he had been standing since before Conrad arrived. He placed Derek's signed and notarized recantation on the table beside the recording device. He placed the forensic analysis of the photographs next to it. He placed his own documentation of the wire transfer to Derek alongside that. Lenora looked at Conrad. "The police are outside," she said. "They've been outside since 1:45. Conrad turned to Nolan, as though Nolan might have a solution. Nolan did not have a solution. Nolan was looking at the stack of documents on the table with the expression of a person watching a bridge they have just crossed collapse behind them. Conrad tried once more. He said the recording proved nothing that a good lawyer couldn't explain away. He said Teresa Mendes was a dying woman with motive to fabricate a confession. He said the photographs were a misunderstanding. He was still talking when Lenora stood up, and she let him finish, because she had learned long ago that there is a specific and clarifying power in letting a person exhaust every version of their own story before you respond. "Teresa gave me a notarized statement," Lenora said when he stopped. "Signed, witnessed, and filed with a third-party legal depository. It details every instruction you gave her, the amount you paid her, and the specific arrangements made at Westbrook Medical. The recording is corroboration. Derek's retraction removes your only witness." She walked to the door of the drawing room and opened it. "I don't have to convince you, Conrad. I only had to make sure the right people had everything they needed." The officers came in from the front hall. Conrad was charged that afternoon with conspiracy to commit murder of a minor and fraud in the obstruction of a lawful inheritance. The additional counts: bribery, falsification of medical records, 2 decades of financial misappropriation from the Holstead estate's subsidiary accounts, came as the investigation widened over the following weeks. Nolan was walked out behind him, his charges beginning with financial fraud and wire transfer theft, and extending to evidence tampering and conspiracy. Conrad turned in the doorway. He looked at Tessa, and whatever was in him, the thing that had decided a 6-month-old child was a problem to be resolved, surfaced one final time. He said that no matter what any document or court decided, a girl who had grown up the way she had grown up would never be a Holstead in any way that mattered. He said it with contempt, and he said it clearly, which was the first honest thing he had said since walking through the door. Tessa looked at him. She let the sentence land, and then she answered it straight. She said he was right, that she had been hungry, that she had slept in places that were not fit for sleeping, that she had stood in a restaurant and asked a stranger for bread because she had no other options left. She said all of that was true, and she said it without apology because none of it was something to apologize for. She said that what she had learned in those 8 months about what people were made of when they had nothing left to protect themselves with was worth more than anything Conrad had managed to accumulate in 60 years of having everything handed to him through deception. She said she had been richer than him on the worst night of her life because she had been hungry and still hadn't become what he was. Conrad didn't answer. He was guided through the front door, and the door closed, and the house went quiet. Tessa stood in the drawing room for a moment after they were gone. She looked at her hands, and then she looked at her mother, and Lenora crossed the room and held her the way she had been unable to hold her for 22 years. Not gently, not carefully, but fully, the way you hold someone when you have finally stopped being afraid that holding them means you might lose them. The legal process that followed was not quick, because legal processes rarely are, but it was thorough. The loan agreements Nolan had manufactured under Tessa's name were voided within 6 weeks on the basis of documented fraud. The debt collectors, who had been the last thing she heard before falling asleep for 8 months, had no claim that survived contact with Lenora's legal team. Tessa Navaro was formally recognized as Audrey Rose Holstead, the sole living heir to the Holstead estate. She kept both names, not as a compromise and not as a symbol, but because both of them were true. Tessa Navaro was the person who had read every book in a worn library on Belford Street and believed in the possibility of a future, even when the evidence for it was thin. Audrey Holstead was the name on a birth record, a DNA result, and a room at the end of a second-floor hallway that had been waiting with its blue walls and its small white furniture for longer than she had been alive. She was both of those people. She had always been both of them. She re-enrolled at the university in the spring semester. Her advisor, a woman named Dr. Susan Clark, who had never stopped believing the withdrawal had been a mistake, scheduled her reinstatement meeting for a Tuesday morning and had coffee ready when Tessa arrived. Tessa sat in that office and talked about curriculum requirements and practicum placements and the age range she wanted to teach, and it felt so ordinary and so right that she had to work to keep her expression steady, because the feeling of ordinary, when ordinary has been gone for a very long time, is almost too large to contain in a normal-sized room. The blue room at the end of the second-floor hallway of the Holstead estate was no longer locked. The small white furniture had been supplemented with a reading chair and a desk lamp and 2 shelves of books that Tessa had chosen herself, stacked with the specific logic of a person who knew exactly which books she wanted within reach and which ones could wait. Marlene had replaced the curtains, same blue, slightly different shade, because the originals had gone brittle with age and the room held light differently now. Not like a room that had been preserved, like a room that was being used. The estate itself changed in ways that were hard to point to exactly. There were shoes by the back door. There were dishes in the sink sometimes. There was a particular quality to the sound of the house on Sunday mornings, when Tessa made coffee and Lenora came downstairs in a cardigan she'd owned for 15 years, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about nothing important, which is the most important kind of talking there is. 22 years is a long time to carry the weight of a loss that was not real. Lenora had done it, and it had shaped her in ways she was still finding the edges of. But the thing she had understood that night in the restaurant, when she had set her fork down and looked at a girl in a torn jacket, asking for bread, and felt something move through her that was older than strategy, was that some things are not lost so much as hidden, and that finding them is not luck. It is attention. It is the willingness to stop and look at what is right in front of you and ask yourself without flinching what you are actually seeing. She had seen her daughter. She had stopped. That was all. That in the end was everything. There's something this story keeps coming back to, that the most dangerous kind of poverty isn't about money. It's the kind that lives in a person who looks at someone hungry and sees a problem instead of a human being. Conrad had wealth and position for 22 years and still ended up the poorest person in that drawing room. Tessa had nothing and never once lost herself. If that's the kind of story that stays with you, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll see you in the next one.